Hey guys, I hope you're all having a fantastic Friday morning. I'm here with Jennifer deWinter from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. She studies video games, anime, basically anything and everything pop culture. Thank you for coming on, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So, like I said, you studied anime, music, television, all this pop culture, and I think a lot of us would like to know, like, where's your world 1-1? Where did you start? We're like, how did you start down this path of becoming a college professor that studies, video games and stuff? Because it sounds like a pretty cool job.
Yeah, it was accidental. I started college as a math major. I went through my teen years, like most teenagers in the early 90s, kind of enamored with emergent Japanese popular culture coming to America for the first time in this very public way. And so in the mid to late 90s, I switched over to Japanese as my major, moved to Japan with the intention of going to animation school. So I wanted to learn Japanese in order to enroll in school, which I did. Then I came back to the US to get a master's degree because it was easier to get the equivalent of a green card, my visa stamped, if I had a higher degree. I did that. I moved back to Japan. I saw how many people were making significantly more money than me with a PhD. So my original plan was to come back to the US, get a PhD, and then return to Japan. And I originally started my PhD program in 18th century rhetorical history with a focus on the Scottish Enlightenment.
Kind of opposite side of the globe there, huh?
Right. And my first year of graduate school, I had a professor, Ken McAllister, who's a video game scholar in the program. I took his course on the theory and rhetoric of video games, turned to me and said, you know a lot about anime, video games, and manga. Why don't you research that? And it blew my mind. I'm like, I did not know that that was a thing that you could do. So 100% switched over into video games, manga, and anime, and the trifecta that is that industry. Finished my PhD. In that time, though, I married my husband, and he did not want to live in Japan. And so I joined WPI. Mostly, I took the job because it had interactive media and game development, which is one of the oldest game development programs in the US. Now I direct it, so that's an exciting move for me. And I started the Japanese Project Center. So now we take students from WPI's game development program to Japan for 3 months to work in labs or in game studios.
So you do any work with like Capcom, Square Enix, any of the big ones, Konami?
No, our alumni do, but not for the internships, because the internships are so short and our students don't speak Japanese. And in order to work for those big ones, you have to be able to speak Japanese. So I have to find partners who speak English.
Okay. Indie creates?
Lots of them, yeah. So we have 4 partners in Japan, 2 universities, Ritsumeikan University and Osaka University. And then there are 2 indie startups that have now shown at the Tokyo Game Convention that our students have worked on those games. Yep.
Okay, cool. So like you married your husband, then where does it go from there? Like what does your job entail then? Like I guess, how do you study video games? Because like I study video games from more of a historical aspect. I try not to go deep into the cultural aspect, but I am somewhat fascinated by it. But it's also kind of like a taboo thing to talk about on YouTube or with gaming in general.
Yeah.
So like I go from historical because like I always say video games are the best recorded history you can ever get, because you can read an article about what the designers were thinking about when they made this game or this part of the game or this element of the game, and then you go play it and experience that.
Yeah.
And that's
so I come out of the cultural studies side. That's my training, and I ended up in a production program. And so a lot of the projects that I end up doing now are production based. So I work with VR students and AR and so forth. But when I go to study video games themselves, it depends on how I'm studying them. If I'm having to teach a game design class, I'm studying them for game mechanics, experience design, whatever the innovation is, in order to break it down. And so if I think about a class like the history of gameplay, which I've offered before, and it sounds like magic when I describe it to gamers, and it's in fact not. It's 20 hours a week of hunkering down and playing through the history of games. We start at Choose Your Own Adventure books. We end at the new Nintendo Switch, right? And we're just moving through Mortal Kombat and Sonic the Hedgehog and whatever like the major game from that era is, or whatever is a critical darling, right? It doesn't become successful on the market, but all game designers know it and talk about it, right? So Ico is one of those that very few people play, but game designers love.
Have you, do you guys play Shadow of the Colossus then too, or?
I encourage them to. I don't think it's as strong as Ico in terms of being innovative in introducing a new gameplay mechanic.
No, it's not. But like I always say it as like a good pillar for like video games as art.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. It's beautiful and it's pensive, and it's that early trope of making you complicit in the evil by following the rules of the game, right? Which is what BioShock does as well, right? Which you kindly
don't spoil BioShock. Haven't played it.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's on my backlog, but like there's a shelf over there of my backlog of shame, I call it, and it's just chock full. It's chock full. And it's just like, when do you get the time, you know?
Yep. I understand that because I play games at home and I had to stop putting air quotes of research around it. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm researching. Yes, I'm actually researching right now. So playing through something like that, I think the challenge of it is that anytime a game comes out, the culture around that game wants to play it the best ever. But if you kind of start playing your way through the history of games, the compulsion to figure out the Easter eggs or the final moves or the secret combinations is much lower. And so students don't aim for mastery as much. And so it really kind of shows you how much kind of this sort of social imperative matters in and around games. And that's why I say it sounds fun until you have to think about hunkering down to master 3 characters' final moves in Mortal Kombat, for example. In terms of kind of cultural studies of games, I came to it from a Japanese studies perspective on industry and media. And a lot of what I end up studying is either kind of the 3 major industries of Japan, manga, anime, and video games, which are so closely entwined. We tend to pull them apart and talk about them separately, and we shouldn't be. And so if you start putting them together and considering how they're influencing each other, all of a sudden certain questions that you might ask of one medium make sense in the context of another medium. And more and more in the last 10 years, I've been moving toward industry analysis, international trade, industry analysis of Japanese objects in East Asian markets or in the US market, or in the case of Rayplay, everywhere. And how that puts pressure on policies, on trade agreements, on economic industrial practices, any of those things. Because I find that my students, at least, are very good at talking about people who make games, and they're very good at talking about people who play games, and they're very bad at talking about the people who distribute games. And when you consider that for a long time, when Kotaku used to run its most powerful people in the game industry list, I don't know if you remember that list, always the buyer for Walmart was in the top 10.
Okay.
And so if you don't start considering distribution, international trade agreements and those sorts of things, and understand how that not only affects how you get your game out there, but actually the content of the game, you're not prepping yourself well for a market. So, like,
I guess I'm trying to think where we can go from there. Like, where So you're talking about more about the marketing of gamings and all that. Like, have you found it kind of interesting though how like in the 90s and early 2000s Japanese games were so huge,
Uh-huh.
and you couldn't set foot, like Final Fantasy 7 brought RPGs into the limelight and was the one that basically popularized RPGs for the casual audience. But now, like, you're seeing more and more Western studios or European studios come in and take that limelight. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I in fact wrote a chapter on this. So I'm finishing up a book on Final Fantasy VII, so this is a funny question.
Oh, yeah, you are now, huh?
It's 2 years late, so I'm feeling apologetic. Sorry, Mark Wolf. So I think when you start talking about origin of games and origin of kind of modes of play or of the companies, it starts getting really tricky, right? So if you think about Final Fantasy VII launching what's considered the JRPG era of games, right? Like these big sprawling games of kind of ensemble casts, massive narratives, right? Like that's the JRPG. It's based on D&D. The first JRPG is by an American who moves to Japan, designs Black Onyx based upon hanging out in Hawaii and playing D&D with his friends. And so how much of that sensibility is Japanese and how much of it is US, right? So I think when you start looking at that massive influx, part of it is that there's this dearth in the US market in the late 90s. Part of that was a direct result of the competition between Nintendo and Sega, right? And that's this moment where games become masculinized. Before that, they're firmly in the family. They're firmly gender neutral in many
Nintendo,
ways.
if we're
Well,
gonna be honest.
most of the early games, right? Like even if you look at not all Atari, because of course there's Custer's Last Stand, right? But most of the early games are really open to almost everyone. So you have Pac-Man, you have Miss Pac-Man, you have Adventure, you have many things, right? I have firm memories of being in the 80s and women and men crowded around the Gauntlet arcade, right? So Sega has to be the little fish in a big pond of Nintendo. How do you bifurcate the market and then win part of that market? You start this masculinizing process.
They chose choice. And Sega was choice. Nintendo was more like, okay, we're going to be family friendly, and then Sega was choice. I got that from Console Wars from Blake J. Harris. You read his book?
It's choice, and it's power. Sega is all about masculine power. If you go back and watch all of the old ads, the old television ads, or read any of the magazine ads, it's all about like turbo power, race cars, NASCAR, whatever, right? Like the focus is always on the power of the image, the power of the speed, the power of the black box, right?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden it starts shifting US consumer culture. Meanwhile, Nintendo pisses off Sony.
Yeah.
And they create the PlayStation, and the PlayStation is highly successful, right? PlayStation 2 is still best-selling console ever.
PlayStation 4 at 75 million units sold right now. I mean, it's ridiculous.
And so they create this thing, and that's where we see the JRPG and the big Japanese influx come to the US. It's not via the Nintendo games, even though they're made in Japan. They don't have what's called cultural odor. We don't think, oh, Mario, Japan, or Zelda, Japan. They're kind of cultural neutral. And by cultural neutral, I mean they read as American white. Yeah. Instead, you have this PlayStation marketing to the Japanese market and working with this technology and just allowing size to take over. And so some of it's that. Some of it is that already in the con scene, anime had seen a huge bump up in popularity via if you went to like a gaming convention, there was always an anime room, and they always had fan subbed anime. And I'm
Yeah.
old now, so I remember the era of partial subs, and so that's what people would go to these rooms to watch. Is like sometimes it would be subtitled, and sometimes it wouldn't be, whatever, right? But everyone was watching it, and it popped up demand. So all of a sudden, it pushed licensing, right? That licensing then pushed demand for the Japanese games, but things that had to read like Japanese games, like Japanese anime type games, which is also part of what pushes the JRPG, in a way that it doesn't push some of these other things. So I think that era is super interesting, just in terms of like how Japan is able to enter the US market. And then simultaneously, you can ask the same sorts of questions of why Xbox cannot enter the Japan market. And part of it has to do with this this type of not unified approach to what American culture can be and be consumed, right? So we're consuming anime, manga, JRPG, Japanese, clearly delineated Japanese video games all simultaneously, and the markets drive each other.
Yeah.
I feel like I got off topic. I do that.
A little bit, but it was interesting, to hear that and all that, because it's true. You saw this rise of JRPGs, and then it was like a perfect storm, because at that time Dragon Ball was hitting its height, and a bunch of other animes started coming over because they realized there's a market there, and then okay, well now here's a JRPG like Final Fantasy VII, and it just blew up. It was amazing because it was just this cultural storm of people that weren't just nerds in the back dubbing their own anime and watching it. It was now open to the mass markets, and that helped drive sales and all that.
Well, and Cartoon Network helped that, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you talk about perfect storm and distribution networks, how does that all happen? It happens because Cartoon Network has Vampire Hunter D, Robot Carnival, and one other anime movie I'm blanking on, all show in this one block. And
Toonami.
No, it's before Toonami. It's mid 90s, and it starts the Japanese wave. And everyone actually recognizes this moment with Cartoon Network normalizing the desire for Japanese as a consumable thing.
So let me ask you this then. Like, let's get back to how you do your research. Like, how do you decide then? Like, how do you decide which games are worth playing through and researching and then all that, or how do you decide like which ones aren't? I should say.
Oh heck! Sometimes I get angry.
I don't know if that's what I want to hear. Sometimes I get angry. Bye.
Yeah, I have. You can see research binders behind me right now. So 3 massive binders full of research for one article. And that one was, I'm working on an article about Japanese hand-holding as a game mechanic. And so sometimes it's just listening to people have misconceptions about things that I know are understood differently in a different context. And so I come forward and say, in fact, I understand why you have that conception. I'm going to be a little bit corrective. Sometimes I love the object, but that's actually always the dangerous thing to research. Because as I always tell my students when they want to research something, I'm like, do you love the thing? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, do you want to continue to love the thing? Because the moment you start researching it is the moment that you no longer continue loving the thing. Because the complexity comes out, right? Like, you start seeing all the dirty underside of the thing. And so when I think about the Final Fantasy book, it was that. Some of it, when I think about why me and my co-editor, Carly Kosirik, started the book series, Influential Game Designers, it was a corrective. And we now have 3 books out under that. We got 3 more coming out soon. That game studies scholars tend to focus on players and text. And they don't, and by text, I mean the video game, right? So they focus on players and text, and they don't focus on the people who make it very often. And they just pretend that, well, they don't even pretend, they often say players are co-creators of the video game, right? Like, to play a video game is to write the video game. And what we saw in that was this sort of effacement of experience design, that these people are working in teams and that they have this vision. And if you think about what a game designer does, they translate experiences into systems. And the act of play translates systems back into experiences. And hopefully the design is good enough that the intended experience and the lived experience are close.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was it was a gentle corrective of like, you can't ignore these people. They are creators, and they're conscientious, collaborative, complicated creators. And that there is no playing the game to write your own text without them first doing the framework for you.
So, like, you mentioned you're writing a book on Final Fantasy VII.
Yes.
Let's go there. Where did that start? What was the driving force behind that? Like, was it the remake or was it the cultural impact of Final Fantasy VII?
No, it was a personal impact. Final Fantasy VII remains my favorite game ever. I still vividly remember the living room I lived in as I played that for hours and hours and hours upon end when it first came out.
Was that your first RPG?
No, not at all. Not at all. I was in my 20s and hunkering in to play Final Fantasy VII. And I can go into many reasons why I love that game and still hold it up as a game that we should be paying attention to. And so for years, I had been presenting at conferences, and Final Fantasy VII was an easy touch point. Like, it's so long and so rich that when I needed an example of something, and I'm like, and in Final Fantasy VII, which my colleagues always make fun of me about, but whatever. And so when Mark Wolf approached me about writing for his book series, Landmark Video Games, and I don't know if you've read any of those. They have one on Doom, one on Myst, one on Silent Hill. They have other ones as well, Tempest. I said, yeah, so long as I can write on Final Fantasy VII.
I'll have to look into that because I haven't heard of him writing these books, but I'll look into it.
Yeah.
Anyways, Final Fantasy VII.
So that's why I chose to write about it. Personal love.
Okay, so how long have you been working on it?
Long before they announced the remake, when I pitched the project.
Okay, were you excited for the remake then?
I don't know. I mean, is anyone really excited for the remake of the thing that they loved in their youth?
Yeah, I am, but I've never played Final Fantasy VII.
You're young. This will be your youth.
Oh, I'm a little young. I'll say that. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I feel like it's interesting, but I'm working like right now. I'm working on 2 videos.
Okay.
And one of them is our video games art, and the other one is the one talking about Final Fantasy VII.
Okay.
Art's gonna come out hopefully next week. Hopefully, it's like this is how much research I got from just you. This is that your book, and then God knows how much more I read up on the internet. And I still feel like I wasn't prepared. But Final Fantasy VII is this interesting thing, because we're talking about it, and it made such a general impact. And I'm really worried because you hear people talking like, "Oh my God, this game's so good! I can't wait for this remake. Oh my God, it changed video games forever." I'm just like, yeah, can they capture that with the remake? And I'm thinking no. And then you hear those stories of it's going to be a 3-part game. It's going to be 3 full games because it's too big to put on one disc. And then now they're bringing it in development internally in Square Enix. I'm just like, this game's not coming out till 2021, maybe. I don't.
Right.
I don't know, but I'm excited for it. But at the same point in time, it's just like I don't think you guys are doing so well there. And Square Enix has not had the best track record as of late when it comes to like their big RPGs. I played Final Fantasy 15, okay? And I hear it's better now, but I put in 40 hours of that game and then it glitched out and then it wouldn't allow me to like go back in time and level up, and so I was done. I was like, okay, I'm done. I know the ending. Look it up on YouTube. I'm done.
Yeah.
And I have all the DLC, but I don't know. That's a whole nother case. But where do you stand? Like, I feel like we're getting to a point where RPGs are actually coming back now. Final Fantasy 15, Kingdom Hearts 3, all these big JRPGs are finally coming back. Persona 5. Oh my God, Persona 5. I love Persona 5. 116 hours, you know, like, and everybody says like it's interesting because here we are, and they're putting more emphasis in games and game development. And Persona is a series that is very steeply drenched in Japanese culture,
Yeah.
but it's so good.
Well, it's interesting too. Well, first, the JRPG never went away, right?
Yeah.
It stopped coming to the US as strongly. But it's interesting sometimes that the games that are over the top Japanese traditional culture tend to do better in the American market than they do in the Japanese market. And so if you look at a game like Okami, and I don't know if you ever played that one.
No. But I know of it. I know of it a little bit.
It's about Amaterasu and Susanoo and kind of like the birth myths of Japan. And it fails in Japan. It's for the PlayStation, and it's a darling in the US. People love it, especially people who self-proclaim loving Japan.
Isn't that the same with Metroid though? Because like here's Metroid, and it always bombs in Japan, but it comes over to America, and there's people out there that swear that Nintendo should just make Metroid games. And I can honestly say Metroid on the NES is one of my favorite games of all time, just because like I'm looking at it as a historical aspect, and at a historical aspect, there's if you put yourself back in that time, that was the first basically open world game that had amazing atmosphere and music and challenging gameplay, and it was amazing what they did with that at that time. And it sucks that then it went to Game Boy, and then it finally came back with Super Metroid, and I love Super Metroid, like Castlevania 79 a little bit
right.
more. But yeah, I mean, like Metroid, but that's kind of like it is, and I believe isn't Xenoblade kind of like that now? Like it does decent in Japan, but it does better over here.
Well, it also depends on how we're counting decent, right? So Japan's youth population is a fraction of what it used to be, right? And so there's sales for these longer games. These longer games are typically played by people in their early 20s, because this is when people have the free time to hunker in and play their Skyrim.
I don't know about that. I'm in my early 20s. I don't have that kind of time. My backlog's 6 miles long.
Right? So it's when they have free time to do things like the massive sprawling narratives, that they can balance this in their brain, that they are not competing with their children for their television, blah, 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 right? So imagine this magic world that you're currently residing in.
Okay.
And so Japan, numbers-wise, actually, population-wise, does not have as many of that population anymore. The birth rate in Japan is inverted. And by that, I mean, it's in steep decline. They're not even replacing their population with birth rate.
Yeah.
And so when you compare that with the US, which has growing birth rates or growing populations, not necessarily based on birth rate, sometimes the market comparison is not as strong. But I hear you with this sense of these markets run so differently. Japan had a freak out a number of years ago. Inafune declared that the Japan market was dead, very famously at a Tokyo Game Show, which I enjoyed thoroughly. And it didn't make sense. I think what he was reacting to is through the 80s and early 90s, there was no meaningful competition to the Japanese game market.
Yeah.
And now there's significant competition, not just to the Japanese game market, but to the console market, right? So Steam is undermining traditional console distribution. And so the fact that consoles can still release and still release well, like the Switch is doing as well as it is.
That's amazing.
Right.
You gotta look at it from that, because let's be honest, besides if you take Zelda and Mario out of the Switch's first year, I don't think we'd be talking about it the way we were. And those are both definitely Wii U games that were just, we're just gonna hold those back.
Well, with the Switch, right? Like, so this is Nintendo's strategy all the time, is to take their old technology, adapt it a little bit, and upgrade it a tiny bit. So yes, it is a Wii U game, in that the Switch is kind of a Wii U plus platform, in the same way that the Wii U was Nintendo DS plus platform, right? So you can kind of go back in that way. they were both always intended for the Switch, that they were co-developed for the Switch. And Nintendo is one of the few console developers that has always been very smart about maintaining some of its own IP for console launch. Whereas Microsoft has always had to partner for their console launch. And that's a hilarious process. I don't know how much you know about partnering for pre-launch game development.
Can't
but
be easy.
It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of in my entire life, right? Like I was talking to a developer once who got a contract to do a pre-launch development for Microsoft. And they started developing under how they understood the specs were going to be running. And then Microsoft said, oh, we're going to radically change the input devices, right? Because they were imagining, do you remember when they released the, oh crap, why am I blanking on the name of them? The stupid wand?
PlayStation Move, Wii.
The Microsoft version of it.
Kinect.
And so they were about to launch the Kinect, but at no time did they ever describe like the bar, the sensory input. Like they didn't say that it was going to use the body as an input. They were like, we're going to revolutionize input. So you have to like design this game for revolutionary input. And this developer I was talking to was like, well, what is that? And they're like, we can't tell you, NDA.
Oh, Jesus.
And so like oftentimes when we look at launch titles, we're like, what the fuck were they thinking, right? Like they weren't thinking anything, that they were desperately in the dark the whole time as well, right? And there are obvious exceptions to this, right? Bungie had a ridiculously successful launch with the original Microsoft. But part of that is that Halo had to teach people the controller for like this new massive controller system. And so they had to have the controller in hand in order to design a game that used every button of the controller. That was their imperative. So then you look at Nintendo. Would we be talking about the Switch without Zelda or Mario? Yes, of course we would, because there's no way they would have released it without Zelda or Mario. Like they'll never release a new platform without their flagship games on it.
Yeah, but I'm talking about in their launch year. Like let take Zelda and Mario out of it. There's no way we'd be talking about the Switch, no doubt. But I don't know if it'd be maybe a little more successful than the Wii U. But at the same point in time, it just wouldn't be like 15 million units sold. You know, software units are at 52.8. It's ridiculous how much better this system has done in the last year or 10 months than the Wii U did in 5 years. Yeah, 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think some of it buys into kind of parental late capitalism, right? Why do Nintendo consoles continue to succeed when they often give you less than like a Sony PlayStation console or an Xbox console, or even Steam, right? They often give you less than these things. And they succeed because Nintendo has turned itself into the console of children and mothers.
Yeah, and nostalgia of people like me.
Nostalgia marketing, right?
I got my Switch right here.
No, it's tremendous nostalgia marketing. But ultimately, I decided to buy a Switch almost immediately because I have 2 children at home. And it wasn't Zelda or Mario that was our first game. It was Splatoon and ARMS.
Really?
Because those are the ones that all the kids were talking about, right? So when 9-year-olds get together to talk, it's Splatoon and ARMS.
Not Mario. You didn't like, okay, in all your studies, you weren't like, no, you're going to play the good games. Here's Zelda. Here's Mario.
I give my children the freedom, because that's always the danger of having a mom who knows too much about this, is I can become overbearing easily.
I want, if I ever have kids, which I don't know, I'm gonna start them out on the NES. They're gonna beat Mega Man before, like OG Mega Man, before they can get anything else. Then you gotta go through Zelda, and I'm not, no guides, no internet. You're gonna play it the old way, like a level system.
I will enjoy reading your memoir of how that goes.
But this is stupid. They throw the controller down. Hey, you come back here. This has historical relevance. It's
interesting. I talk about this a lot with people, that video games, when you talk about nostalgia marketing, right? Or when you talk about why certain media continue on that they do. Some of it is that parents want to provide for their children the same experience that they had when they were children, right? And so what books do my children read at certain points? They were the same books that I read at that age, right? What movies do we watch? I'm like, you're going to freaking watch Goonies whether you want to or not, because I watched Goonies when I was your age, right?
Commando.
And so when you think about in board games too, right? Like, how do we start off with board games? We start off with Candyland, because I have this distinct memory of starting off with Candyland, and we move through to Parcheesi or whatever the board game is, right? And of course, we're having a board game renaissance, so we also play other things, but we're still playing the games of my childhood or my husband's childhood. That gets trickier with video games, right? For exactly what you were kind of talking about, that the technology starts feeling dated and old. Sometimes it's hard to get a hold of the games or a hold of the technology unless you're getting a port of it somehow. But then is it the same experience if you're not having to like deal with the cramp of like the Atari controller in this thing that's just driving you crazy? And so we want to pass on this nostalgia to our children, and we want to relive it ourselves, right? Like, I sat down and rewatched the Goonies. Likewise, I have an NES at home, and we do play these old games. But they feel dated in video games in a way that they don't
in movies and TV and books.
Right.
Yeah, and it's sad, but I always say, if you like, I've talked to people about retro games, and people are like, I only play the new stuff. I don't want to play anything old. But I'm just like, to play an old game, I have to put my mind in that time. You know what I mean? And be like, this was as good as it got, and that was it. That, Mega Man, one of my all-time favorite games. I played that game probably at least 1,000 times, and I've only had it for like 3 years. Because didn't get an NES till like 3 years. That's a whole nother story. But like, I still love that game and I enjoy that game. And there's times where I'm just like, I'm not in the mood for an 8-bit graphics. I want to see this giant, open, sprawling, beautiful world. And that's so I played the newest Assassin's Creed or Horizon. Or sometimes I want to play a Indiana Jones-esque story, Uncharted.
That kind of goes back to your early question about, am I excited about Final Fantasy VII? Jury's still out, but do I understand why they're remaking it? If you can't get other people to go back and play these old games because they refuse to play retro games, but the story still holds, should you remake it?
Yeah, I can see it. I think Final Fantasy VII is either gonna sink or float or sink, or fly or die. Because it's either going to be like, oh my God, this is just like everybody always says when a remake comes out, this is how I remember the graphics looking. This is how I remember the story. And if they can capture that, they're golden. But if they can't, and it only takes that one instance where it's completely radically different, and somebody's like, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. But that's for the replayers, not for the new people.
Yeah, the new people are going to play through it all they want. And that's the best part about putting in a new game. But at the same point in time, we're at a point where people don't finish games. People don't, put a lot of time into games. They want to sit down, play a couple of rounds, and be done. That's why multiplayer is so popular anymore, because you can come home, put in your Battlefront 2 or whatever, play a couple of rounds, and you're done for the day.
Or Todd Howard.
Who's Todd Howard?
Todd Howard, maker of Skyrim. Maker of massive, sprawling, crazy...
Okay, I got you now.
For a while.
Yeah, Skyrim's amazing. I played. I don't want to admit how many hours I put in that game.
You probably could not surprise me on this one, right? Or you have World of Warcraft, where people reorganize their life around that thing.
That's ridiculous. I have a friend who's been playing WoW for over 10 years. I'm just like, get a life. Because I'm not a PC guy. I'm not dedicated to any console, but I'm not a massive online multiplayer guy. I played it. There's a few instances when I do it, but I'm just like, I want to sit down on that couch behind me, boot up on my giant TV, and just sink into my couch and play.
Yep.
That's how I am, and that's how I'm always going to be. There are a few exceptions, like Friday the 13th, and I kind of got into Black Ops Zombies a little bit, but then that was it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna go. I'm not that guy. But people do that. I have a friend who's like, okay, every Thursday I'm playing WoW for 6 hours because we're gonna go do a dungeon or whatever. And I'm just like, you guys are nuts.
Yep.
I don't know. So what else are you working on now? Let's get kind of back to that. You're working on a book. You guys, so the influential game designer series is still going on.
It
What
is.
else? What else is you guys working on? You guys working on Tom Howard then, or?
So I have an author right now for the influential game design series writing about Todd Howard.
Okay.
I have another person writing about Gary Gygax, and another person writing about Kojima.
Okay. What about Amy Hennig?
Not yet. So I do not solicit them. People come to me as the book series editor and say, I want to write about this person. And so,
Okay.
so far we have, of course, the book on Miyamoto, but also Jane Jensen, who's freaking amazing, and Brenda Laurel, who's just this luminary in the field.
Mm-hmm.
So we have, like I said, 3 books out already in that series, 3 coming out soon. I had a lot of articles. We just got a book chapter. My look of concern is that I'm beginning to feel overwhelmed by the amount of writing that I have to do quickly. We just got a book chapter accepted on the Chinese game industry.
Oh,
So
that's interesting.
I'm working with 2 of my Chinese students, Bolin and Jing, to do that. And that's been a learning curve for me because I do not know that industry as well.
I don't know it as well. It's hard to find information on the Chinese games industry. All
Uh,
I, the only thing off the top of my head is I know a Chinese developer paid for Red Ash, and we haven't seen it yet. That's
yeah,
it.
they are now the largest games industry in the world.
I thought they are. I
They
thought
are.
it was the U.S. and China.
Nope, China is now the largest games industry in the world, hands down, the world.
Really? Well,
Uh,
we gotta go take that back. I'm gonna go out on this corner.
Yep. And it's insane. And their mobile market is really well established, partly because the consoles were banned there until the early 2000s.
Oh.
And they did like these strange homegrown national policies to try and bring their own market up. Anyways, it's a super interesting industry to look at as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something. How much like handheld market is interesting in the United States because it does well, like the 3DS and all that. And it's sad to say the Vita didn't do so hot, but I love my Vita. But in Japan, the Vita is still selling units. The PSP is still selling new games.
Yeah.
And these handhelds just don't die in Japan. They just keep going. How much do you think of that is because it's a mobile it's a mobile city, like everyone in Japan's always moving. You don't really stay at home all the time.
Right. I don't know if you've seen Sam Tobin's book about the DS. He wrote a whole book about the DS as a platform. I remember talking to Sam one time about exactly this, right? Because people always ask me why they continue to survive there and flourish, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they flourish for many of the reasons that you just said, including public transportation. Japan is predominantly dependent on public transportation. You're taking a train or a bus to school or to work upwards of 2 hours each way every day.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so whatever it is needs to fit in your pocket in order to play, and you just want to be brain dead on your way. And Sam was saying, as we were talking about this, he goes, yeah, I couldn't have written the book about the DS had I not lived in New York at the time.
Mm-hmm.
For the same reason that so much public transportation begets a need for public distraction that's socially acceptable. And so the culture of the handheld really takes off in Japan before the smartphones do.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though the smartphones have plenty of games on them, and I'm obsessed with Tsum Tsum online, it's not ever going to 100% replace these other devices. I mean,
Yeah.
as you know, I'm sure, uh, technology doesn't consolidate, it diversifies, right?
Yeah. Well, we did try the technology with remember it was I think it was Nikita or whatever, and they made like a cell phone handheld hybrid.
Right.
I think if they tried putting that out again, I think that'd be cool. I really think that that's something that could work now, but at the same point in time, you'd have to do it extremely well,
Yeah.
or it wouldn't. It'd be about the same as the first time.
Early attempts to change markets often fail, right? The markets, especially media markets, are really conservative. It's always tried and true with a twist.
Hmm.
That it can't be revolutionarily different. Like if you point out a game to me that you think is revolutionary different, I will point out that it was not, or that it economically failed.
Really, Ocarina of Time.
Ocarina of Time is not revolutionarily different. It's tried and true with a twist. The only twist is the introduction of music.
I thought it's like a if you look at Ocarina of Time, like a lot of its game designs and all that are in more open world games today. You
But
can see like the
but it's
thread.
something out of that tradition that's already happening at that moment in Japan of
True.
the open world design.
That's true. Okay, I'll give it to you. Now I'm just gonna go hide in my corner.
So the twist is music.
Yeah, the music is so good in that game. Oh my god, it's so good. Why do you think they was focused on music in Japan so much? Like you could see it in like Mega Man, Zelda, Final Fantasy 6, Final Fantasy 7, both of which I haven't played, but you know I know the music. I've heard the music from them. Amazing games, amazing music. I wonder, is that a cultural aspect or is that something new,
That
or
is
is
an
that
excellent question. I've never actually considered that question spoken in that way. So let me think if I can think through it. Um, where I would probably start to answer that question would be on the history of anime at that point. Um, and that if you consider character-based Japanese games as playable anime, uh,
okay?
then you can probably borrow from that sort of culture of anime having high production value because they have high economic value. Uh, so I wonder. So this is a soft answer because I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder if it has to do with that anime had already had a strong base in bringing in expert composers
Mm-hmm.
and then translating that over. I think also, okay, I'm going to continue to think through the answer to this one. I think also Japan is really interested in environmental design. Um, and man, I breezed through it in the book on Miyamoto. But when you think through the aesthetics of Shintoism is not just the veneration of nature, that's there. It's also the aestheticization of nature. And so you get uh, Japanese gardens as highly aesthetic forms, and you get music and wind chimes as aestheticizing environments. And so I wonder how much of the question that you're asking is about the environment having to present strong aesthetic form for the
Mm-hmm.
experience. And I'll bet you it has something closely tied to that.
Probably. I just find it interesting how you see like in Keiichi Inafune how he made like Mega Man in Japan is Rockman and it's you know Mega Man and bass or Rockman and bass and then you know there's Bass in Trouble, Rush, uh, what now? What's Roll? Rock and Roll is you know Rockman and Roll and all that. And it's just kind of funny how you see all these musical references and then like they put so much emphasis on the sound and all that. And it's good. It comes out as good music. People are, you know, you see people making remixes of the Mega Man 2 theme song today.
Well, then there's an interesting young man. I think he's at Princeton University. I'm typing his name right now. Um, Schwartzman, Nintendo Music. Come on. Why am I blanking on? There's a book out of Bloomsbury. Nintendo Music. Here we go. Click in. No, I don't sign me up. I don't care about your. Yeah, so I was right on the name. So a young man named Andrew Schwartman wrote the book Koji Kondo's Super Mario Brothers soundtrack. It's a very short book, and he is a musician, and he starts grappling with some of what you're talking about, not with Mega Man, but I bet you that there's a lot of overlap with that. So if you're interested in music, it's understudied. Like, it's so understudied. We hire out of the industry to teach our game, audio, and music course Keith Zizza, and he started with Roberta Williams' company, and then moved forward. And you would know him from like BioShock Infinite soundtrack and other stuff. He's highly talented and been doing it for a few decades now. And he just continues to say that there's hardly anything out there other than how-to books. Like, no one's carefully considered this area.
Okay. Well, I think I'm satisfied with the podcast for now. Unless you got anything else you want to talk about, like anything you want to talk. I just over this podcast, I'm like, well, geez, she knows a lot more than I'll ever know about culture and all that. But then again, I think it's because like we approach it from two different areas. You know what I mean?
I've been doing it for 1 or 2 years longer too.
Oh yeah, just one. I'm just a year older than you. Time travel's amazing.
So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, like I like the idea of talking with people that approach games in a different light. You know, like you're cultural, I'm more historical. You know, and it's cool to see. And I just realized I don't know much jack all about culture. Call me a redneck from Nebraska, I suppose.
It takes a long time. There were so many times when I'm like, why is that happening? So when I said like anger often motivates myself, also just downright confusion will motivate me for research projects.
Yeah, I'm more just like like I said, history. So like I'll be like, oh my god, Final Fantasy 7, and it'll just hit me and all. Next thing you know, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm home, and then it's 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm just reading interviews, schedules, all that good jazz, and I'm just dumb stuff that I remember and won't let go of until, I don't know, maybe never. But it's interesting, and like I said, I just like approaching games from gaming is just that one medium, and pop culture in general, where you can approach it from many different aspects. It's always fun and interesting to talk about.
I'm 100% behind you.
Yeah, that's why I was like I was like, wow, she's just culture all the way. I need to get out of the house more. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this kind of unorthodox podcast. It was a little different than what I usually try to do, but I hope it was interesting. Jennifer, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much.
We'll have to do this again sometime because I feel like I need to learn more. That being said, guys, I once again thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon. Bye. You don't want to say bye?
Goodbye.
Okay.